Welcome to Neural Nexus Podcast, where we explore the hottest topics shaping the world. Let's dive in.
Okay, so imagine this. International tensions are running high, tariffs are flying back and forth, and suddenly, a presidential plane is offered up as a bargaining chip.
A presidential plane.
You heard me right. It's a wild situation down in Colombia with some serious implications. So, buckle up, because today we're going deep on this diplomatic standoff.
Yeah, this is a fascinating one. It all starts with something that seems pretty routine, the U.S. trying to send Colombian migrants back home.
Right, but this is anything but routine with Trump back in the Oval Office.
Yeah, you've got Trump with his America First agenda, and then you have Petro, Colombia's president.
Who, just as a reminder for our listeners, is a self-described socialist.
Exactly, and he's already viewed with some skepticism by the U.S. government.
To put it mildly.
Right. And then you add in his demands for very specific protocol for accepting the migrants back, and boom, you've got a recipe for tension.
So Petro calls it dignified treatment for the migrants, but what does that actually look like, practically speaking?
Well, it's more than just a comfortable flight back. Petro might be demanding things like access to legal counsel for the migrants upon arrival.
Oh, I see.
Guarantees of housing and job assistance, maybe even a formal apology from the U.S. for their deportation.
Wow.
He's trying to protect his citizens and score political points at the same time.
So Petro draws this line in the sand, and how does Trump react?
He doesn't back down.
Not a chance.
Trump hits Colombia with a 25% tariff on all goods.
Oof.
And he doesn't do it quietly either. He goes on Truth Social, calls Petro very unpopular with his people, and threatens to double the tariffs within a week if Petro doesn't play ball.
That's a classic power move right out of the Trump playbook.
Yeah, it's a classic Trump pressure tactic for sure.
And it's not just about Colombia, it's also about Trump's base back home, right?
Absolutely. His approval ratings are heavily tied to his perceived toughness on immigration.
He needs to look strong.
Exactly. He has to be seen taking a hard line to appease his base.
So we've got Petro trying to protect his citizens and his image, and Trump playing to his base and his America First agenda. It's a clash of ideologies for sure. Yeah. But where does the presidential plane fit into all of this?
Well, facing immense pressure from these tariffs, Petro makes a dramatic move. He offers up his presidential plan for migrant repatriation.
Wow.
It's a huge gesture, almost theatrical.
Yeah, it's definitely attention-grabbing.
But it also highlights the economic strain he's under. The U.S. is Colombia's biggest trading partner. These tariffs hit hard.
It's interesting you say Petro's trying to reduce Colombia's economic dependence on the U.S., but can he really afford to alienate his biggest trading partner?
It's a tightrope walk for sure. He's calling for Colombian businesses to diversify their exports, but that takes time and resources. And meanwhile, these tariffs are already impacting key industries.
Sure.
We're talking Colombian coffee growers, textile manufacturers, flour exporters, all facing potentially devastating losses.
So Petro offers his plane, trying to de-escalate things, but does it work?
Well, not exactly. He also retaliates with his own 25% tariffs on U.S. imports, almost immediately matching Trump.
So he's not backing down either.
Nope. And then, just to up the ante, he escalates that to a 50% tariff.
Wow. This is getting serious.
It is. Yeah, it's a classic tit-for-tat escalation, and you have to wonder, is Petro overplaying his hand?
You said he's trying to project strength, but going toe-to-toe with Trump on tariffs, that's a bold, maybe even reckless move.
It's a gamble, that's for sure, especially when you look at the potential impact on the Colombian economy. The agricultural sector, which employs a significant portion of the population, could be crippled, and rising import prices from the U.S. will likely fuel inflation, hurting everyday Colombians.
So we've got this economic tug-of-war going on, but what about the political fallout? This can't be good for U.S.-Colombia relations.
It's definitely a strain. These two leaders, ideologically opposed, are now engaged in a very public and very aggressive power struggle. It throws decades of cooperation into question.
Cooperation on some pretty major issues, too, like drug trafficking, for example. Colombia has been a key U.S. ally in that fight.
Exactly. And then there's counterterrorism. Colombia's internal conflicts have often spilled over into regional security concerns. The U.S. has provided substantial aid and intelligence sharing to help stabilize the region.
But with this level of hostility, can that cooperation continue?
It's hard to say. If this escalates further, we could see a breakdown of trust intelligence sharing dries up, and that can have serious security implications for both countries.
It's like the standoff is exposing the cracks in the foundation of their relationship.
And it's not just about the U.S. and Colombia. this situation is playing out against a backdrop of rising nationalism globally. We're seeing a shift towards more transactional zero-sum diplomacy,
Hmm.
meaning countries are increasingly focused on what they can get, even at the expense of others. Cooperation and compromise are being replaced by aggression and brinkmanship.
So this US-Colombia standoff could be a sign of things to come, a preview of how international relations might play out in the future.
It's certainly a possibility. And it's not just limited to trade disputes. Think about climate change, for example. If countries prioritize their own economic interests over global cooperation, finding solutions to these existential threats becomes even more difficult.
This is starting to feel pretty bleak. Is there any reason for optimism?
Well, amidst all this political maneuvering, let's not forget about the human element the Colombian migrants caught in this standoff. Their lives are being upended by these political decisions.
You're right. We've been so focused on the economic and political implications, we haven't really talked about the impact on the migrants themselves.
Think about it. They're facing deportation from the US, a country many have called home for years. They're returning to a Colombia grappling with economic uncertainty and political instability, and their fate hangs in the balance as these two leaders continue this power struggle.
It's a stark reminder that these aren't just abstract geopolitical games. There are real people with real lives at stake.
And their stories are often overlooked in the grand narratives of diplomacy and trade wars.
So we've got escalating tariffs, political posturing, and a humanitarian crisis brewing. But let's go back to that presidential plane for a moment. Petro offered it up as a gesture of goodwill, or at least a sign that he was serious about getting these migrants back.
It was a dramatic move, no doubt, and it definitely caught the world's attention. But was it a genuine attempt at de-escalation, or was it simply a calculated political maneuver to gain sympathy and shift the narrative?
You're saying it could have been a way to portray himself as the reasonable one, the one trying to find a solution, while Trump is just throwing his weight around.
Exactly. It's hard to know Petro's true intentions, but the optics were certainly in his favor.
Okay, so Petro makes this grand gesture with his plane, but the tariffs are still in place, and the rhetoric hasn't exactly cooled down. What happens next?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It feels like this situation could go in a lot of different directions.
Absolutely. There are so many variables at play: domestic politics in both countries, global economic trends, the actions of other international players. It's a complex web of interconnected forces.
We could see further escalation with even harsher sanctions and retaliatory measures.
Or perhaps cooler heads will prevail and some kind of negotiated settlement will emerge.
But even if they do manage to find a way out of this immediate crisis, the underlying tensions will remain. The ideological clash between these two leaders, these shifting dynamics of global power, those aren't going away anytime soon.
You're right. This standoff is just a symptom of a much larger geopolitical transformation.
Okay, so what can we as informed citizens take away from all of this? What does this deep dive into presidential plane diplomacy and the ensuing trade war actually tell us?
It tells us that the world is changing and fast. The old rules of diplomacy are being rewritten. We're seeing a rise in nationalism, a shift towards more transactional and aggressive approaches to international relations. And this has real-world consequences not just for politicians and economies, but for everyday people caught in the crossfire.
So what does this mean for you? What can you do with this information? We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll explore those questions and more. We're back, and the story, presidential planes, tariffs, a whole lot of tension between the US and Colombia. But here's the thing. What can we learn from all of this?
Well, this situation really highlights something we've been seeing more and more of, this collision of economic interests with human rights.
Right. We can't forget about those Colombian migrants at the heart of all of this. What happens to them when they're caught between these political power plays?
It raises some tough questions. Is it ethical for the U.S. to pressure another country into accepting deportees, especially when the conditions they're returning to might be unstable or even dangerous?
Right.
And on the flip side, can Petro use his own citizens as leverage in a trade dispute? These are the moral dilemmas that pop up when diplomacy turns into a bargaining game.
Yeah, it's a reminder that these global events we hear about on the news, they have a very real human cost. It's easy to get lost in the numbers, the tariffs, the political rhetoric, and forget about the individuals whose lives are directly impacted.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to engage with these issues on a deeper level. Don't just accept the headlines at face value. Dig deeper. Ask questions. Consider the different perspectives at play.
You mentioned earlier that this situation could be a sign of things to come in international relations. More of this America First zero-sum approach. That's got to be concerning, right?
It is because it undermines international cooperation just when we need it most. Think about the challenges we're facing globally: climate change, pandemics, cyber threats. These are issues that require countries to work together, not against each other.
So if presidential planes become bargaining chips and economic might trumps diplomacy, what does that mean for the future of global cooperation?
Well, it's not a pretty picture. A world where might makes right, where the powerful dictate terms to the less powerful. A world where international agreements and institutions are weakened and conflict becomes more likely.
Okay, so that's the potential downside. But is there anything we as individuals can do to push back against this trend, to promote a more cooperative and humane approach to global affairs?
Absolutely. Start by staying informed, understand the issues, the different perspectives, the stakes involved, and then use your voice.
Yep.
Engage in conversations, share your insights, challenge those who promote narrow self-interested views, support organizations working to build bridges between nations, and promote global cooperation.
It sounds like you're saying we can't afford to be passive observers. We have to be active participants in shaping the future we want to see.
Exactly, because ultimately the future of global relations is not predetermined. It's shaped by the choices we make, the actions we take, and the voices we raise.
So that's it for our deep dive into presidential plane diplomacy and the escalating trade war between the US and Colombia. The world is changing, the stakes are high, and we all have a role to play. Stay informed, engage with the issues, and use your voice to promote a more cooperative and just world. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.